She is my wife. Maybe I wasn't joking.
I wish that were true.
Then don't run this time, Bea.
Heavy against Beatrice's spine, Henry's arm felt like a solid wall of wool and heat amidst the ballroom's scent of melting wax, crushed roses, and sour panic. Flashing a lazy, shielding grin at the dowager, he declared, "She is my wife." Though his words were a lie, the true tragedy lay in her reply. It is a specific sort of hell to be 27, unmarried, and wearing a corset laced by a maid who hates you. Beatrice stood against the far wall of the Harrington Estate's grand ballroom, feeling the abrasive scratch of flocked velvet through the thin muslin of her gown. The air in the room was visibly thick. 300 bodies pressed together beneath the glare of gas chandeliers generated a humid, stifling heat. It smelled of things people tried to hide: nervous sweat, stale lavender water, the metallic tang of melting beeswax, and the sour breath of old men drinking too much port. There was no romance here, only commerce. She watched her younger cousin Lillian being spun in a waltz by a viscount who had inherited a rotting manor and a desperate need for her dowry. Lillian looked terrified. The viscount looked hungry. Beatrice shifted her weight, her right heel aching where a blister had formed an hour ago. She wanted a glass of cold water. She wanted to take off her shoes. Mostly, she wanted to be invisible. If Lady Danbury looks at me one more time like I am a prized ham at a country fair, I am going to walk into the ornamental lake. The voice came from her left, low, gravelly, and bone-tired. Beatrice didn't turn her head. She didn't need to. The lake is frozen, Henry. You'd only break your ankles. One. Henry Pendelton, the Duke of Westmorland, leaned his shoulder against the velvet wall beside her. He didn't look like a duke tonight. He rarely did. His cravat was already slightly askew, a smudge of white powder from some eager debutante's shoulder, staining the dark wool of his lapel. He smelled of harsh tobacco, cloves, and damp winter air. "A broken ankle would excuse me from the rest of the season," he muttered, crossing his arms. He looked out at the churning sea of silken tailcoats with undisguised exhaustion. "I think it's a fair trade." They were not supposed to be standing together, a duke and a spinster daughter of a deceased baron. But Henry and Beatrice had established this corner as a demilitarized zone 3 years ago, shortly after her second engagement fell apart in public ruin, and shortly after he inherited a title he never wanted from a brother he despised. They shared a mutual, cynical understanding. She offered him a shield against the aggressive mothers of the ton, and he offered her the social protection that came from occasionally being seen conversing with a duke. It kept the pitying stares at bay. "You look terrible," she observed, letting her eyes flick over his face. He did. There were dark bruises of exhaustion under his eyes, and the harsh overhead light caught the premature lines bracketing his mouth. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, the faint rasp of stubble audible over the screech of the violins. "I slept for perhaps 2 hours," he said. "The estate manager in Yorkshire sent another ledger. The roof of the tenant housing is collapsing. The treasury is lighter than my mother's morals, and I am currently being hunted by a pack of women who think a coronet makes up for a crumbling roof." "It does to them," she said simply. "They aren't marrying you for your roof, Henry. They are marrying you so they can walk into a room before the rest of us." He let out a short, unamused laugh. "Christ, Beatrice, you always know exactly how to strip the paint off a house. You prefer I lie?" "God, no." He turned his head, finally looking at her. His eyes were a pale, washed-out gray. They weren't warm, but they were familiar, and right now, familiarity was the only thing keeping her chest from tightening into a panic attack. "Lies are exhausting. It's why I hide with you. You're entirely too mean to lie to me." It was a compliment. In their strange, sharp-edged language, It was a profound compliment, but tonight it landed like a stone in her stomach. Beatrice looked away, focusing on the scuff marks marring the polished oak floorboards. He thought she didn't lie to him. He thought her dry remarks and her unbothered posture were the sum total of Beatrice Hayes. He didn't know that for the past 8 months, every time he walked into a room, her pulse hitched. He didn't know that she had memorized the exact cadence of his uneven footsteps, or that the faint smell of cloves made her throat tight. She was entirely practical. She knew what she looked like. She had mousy brown hair that refused to hold a curl, a nose that was too sharp, and a dowry that wouldn't buy a decent carriage. She was a fixture, furniture, and Henry was a duke. Her affection for him was a humiliating, useless thing. She kept it buried under layers of sarcasm and indifference, terrified that if he ever saw it, the easy camaraderie they shared would curdle into pity. She could survive his indifference. She would not survive his pity. "Incoming," Henry murmured, his posture stiffening. She followed his gaze, plowing through the crowd, parting the sea of pastel gowns like a battleship, was Lady Covington. She was a formidable woman wrapped in violent purple silk. Her eyes locked onto Henry with predatory calculation. Trailing behind her was her daughter, a terrifyingly beautiful girl of 18, with blonde ringlets and the vapid, terrified expression of a sacrificial lamb. "Brace yourself," Beatrice whispered. "She's bringing the heavy artillery." Henry groaned, a quiet, guttural sound of distress. He shifted closer to her. The heat, radiating off his arm, seeped through her thin sleeve. "Don't leave me," he muttered, the instruction urgent and low. "Beatrice, I swear to God, if you abandon me to her, I will burn your house down." "I don't own a house, Henry. My brother does." "Then I'll burn his down. Just don't move." She didn't move. She couldn't have, even if she wanted to. The proximity of him, the solid, unyielding presence of his shoulder against hers, had anchored her feet to the floor. She took a shallow breath, plastering a polite, detached smile on her face, as Lady Covington finally breached their perimeter. "Your Grace." Lady Covington's voice was a shrill trumpet blast that cut through the low hum of the ballroom. She stopped 2 feet from them, her purple silk skirts rustling aggressively. She did not look at Beatrice. To her, Beatrice was merely negative space. "What a surprise to find you lurking in the shadows, and looking so terribly weary. The season takes its toll, does it not?" "It does, Lady Covington," Henry said smoothly. His voice dropped an octave, adopting the bored, aristocratic drawl he used to keep people at arm's length. "The air in here is particularly exhausting." She missed the insult entirely. She thrust a hand behind her and hauled her daughter forward by the wrist. The girl stumbled slightly, her face flushing crimson. "Perhaps you need a turn about the room to invigorate your blood." My Charlotte was just saying how parched she was, and how desperately she wished for a gentleman to escort her to the refreshment room. Charlotte looked as though she wished the floor would open up and swallow her whole. Henry's jaw tightened. He hated this. He hated the auction block of it all. Beatrice saw the muscles in his neck flex against his collar. He opened his mouth to deliver a polite, icy rejection, but Lady Covington was relentless. "Truly, Your Grace, you must mingle more," she pressed, her voice dripping with faux concern, finally pivoting her hawkish gaze toward Beatrice. "It is not healthy for a man of your station to spend the entire evening tucked away in corners with, well, with old friends. People will talk. They will wonder if you have simply given up on securing your lineage." It was a deliberate, nasty swipe. The implication hung in the heavy air. "Why are you wasting time with this dried-up spinster when you could have my fertile, beautiful daughter?" Beatrice's face grew hot. The familiar shame, the bitter pill of her own irrelevance, coated the back of her throat. She looked down, biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted the faint, metallic tang of blood. She prepared to take a step back, to offer Henry an out, to retreat to the edges where she belonged. Before she could move, a heavy, warm hand clamped around her waist. Beatrice jolted, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips. Henry didn't just touch her. He pulled her flush against his side. The sudden impact of his hip against hers, the iron grip of his fingers pressing into the boning of her corset, sent a violent shockwave through her nervous system. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Given up?" Henry asked. His voice was no longer bored. It was dangerously soft, carrying a jagged edge of pure defiance. "On the contrary, Lady Covington, I am entirely settled." The older woman blinked, her heavily powdered face cracking with confusion. "Settled? I do not understand." Henry looked down at Beatrice. From this angle, she could see the pulse beating frantically at the base of his throat. He was acting on impulse, reckless and irritated. He looked back at Lady Covington, a lazy, arrogant smile stretching across his face. "You are a bit late to the chase, my lady," he said, his thumb subtly stroking the fabric at her waist. The friction sent a dizzying heat straight to her brain. "She is my wife. Secretly, of course. We loathe the pageantry of a public wedding." Lady Covington's jaw unhinged. She stared at Henry, then stared at Beatrice, her eyes bugging out. Even Charlotte stopped looking at her shoes and stared at them in mute horror. A joke," Lady Covington stammered, her face turning an ugly shade of puce. "A very poor joke, Your Grace." "I rarely joke about my property," Henry replied, his tone chillingly flat. It was enough. Insulted, humiliated, and realizing she was losing ground, Lady Covington grabbed her daughter's arm. "Come, Charlotte. The air in this corner has grown entirely too foul." She spun on her heel and marched away, practically leaving skid marks on the oak floor. The moment she was swallowed by the crowd, Henry let out a massive exhale, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. He threw his head back and let out a breathless, genuine laugh. God," he rasped, turning to Beatrice, his hand still resting loosely on her waist. "Did you see her face? I thought she was going to have an apoplexy, right there on the rug." "She is my wife. Christ, it was the first thing that came to my mind. Brilliant, wasn't it?" He was grinning. He expected her to laugh. He expected her to roll her eyes, to punch him lightly on the arm, to deliver a scathing remark about his lack of tact. That was the script. That was the rule of their dynamic. But she couldn't breathe. His hand was still on her. The heat of his palm was burning an imprint through the layers of her clothing, straight into her skin. The smell of cloves and tobacco was suddenly overwhelming, dizzying. Her chest felt as though it were wrapped in iron bands. "She is my wife." The words echoed in her skull, mocking her. They were a joke to him, a convenient shield, a weapon to scare away a harpy. But to her, in the cruel, quiet darkness of her own heart, they were the one thing she wanted more than air. The stark contrast between his casual amusement and her agonizing longing cracked something open inside her. The mask slipped. The bitter, cynical armor she wore so perfectly every day simply dissolved into the humid air of the ballroom. Beatrice looked up at him. She didn't smile. She didn't laugh. She felt her eyes prickle with sudden, humiliating heat, and a flush of deep, uncontrollable red crept up her neck, staining her cheeks. Henry's smile faltered, his brow furrowed, noticing the change in her face. His grip on her waist loosened slightly, uncertain. "Are you all right? I know it was crude. I didn't mean to. I wish that were true." The whisper tore out of her throat before she could stop it. It wasn't a calculated statement. It was a raw, bleeding confession, fragile and pathetic. The moment the words left her mouth, terror seized her. It was cold and absolute. She had ruined it. She had ruined the only good thing in her life. Henry froze, The music around them seemed to instantly mute. The chatter, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of silk, it all vanished, leaving a ringing silence in her ears. He stared at her. The amusement bled out of his gray eyes, replaced by a stark, naked shock. She watched his pupils dilate, swallowing the iris. His breath hitched, stalling in his chest. For one long, agonizing second, neither of them moved. He didn't pull his hand away, but his fingers went entirely rigid against her waist. He didn't know what to do. The cynic had no script for this. The man who deflected everything with sarcasm was suddenly faced with a bleeding wound, and he had no bandages. The silence stretched, turning brutal. The shock in his eyes began to shift, morphing into something that looked terribly like panic. She couldn't bear it. She couldn't watch pity form on his face. Beatrice, violently jerked out of his grip. The sudden absence of his hand felt like a blast of winter air. "Excuse me," she choked out, her voice sounding like gravel. She didn't wait for him to speak. She didn't look at him again. She turned, gathered her skirts in fists that were trembling violently, and fled. She shoved her way through the dense crowd, ignoring the indignant mutters of the people she bumped into. She just needed to escape the heavy, suffocating air of the ballroom. She needed to escape the disastrous, ruined wreckage of her own making. The Harrington Conservatory smelled of wet earth, dying orchids, and copper. It was a massive, glass-domed structure tacked onto the side of the manor, kept suffocatingly humid by iron pipes, rattling with steam. Condensation dripped down the arched windows, blurring the gaslights from the terrace into smears of sickly yellow. Beatrice shoved the heavy iron door shut behind her, the latch dropping with a rusted, definitive clank. She walked until her knees hit the edge of a wrought iron planter box, and then she simply stopped functioning. Her lungs refused to pull air past the rigid whalebone of her corset. The velvet of her gown felt like a suffocating second skin. She gripped the cold, damp iron of the planter, bowing her head as a violent tremor racked her shoulders. I wish that were true. She had stripped herself bare in the middle of a crowded room. She had handed Henry the knife, guided the blade to her own ribs, and invited him to twist it. The humiliation was a physical ache, a sour burn in the back of her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing the heels of her palms into her cheekbones, until flashes of static exploded behind her eyelids. She needed to leave. She needed to find the cloakroom, summon a hackney carriage, and disappear back to her brother's drafty townhouse before Henry could find her and offer an agonizingly gentle apology. The heavy iron door groaned on its hinges. The sound was like a gunshot in the damp, quiet room. Beatrice ripped her hands away from her face, her spine snapping straight. Henry stood in the doorway. He looked entirely out of place among the creeping ferns and the drooping, exotic blooms. The dim light cast harsh shadows across the planes of his face, accentuating the exhaustion in his features. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling against the crisp white of his waistcoat. He had not bothered to bring his jacket. He was in his shirt sleeves, his cravat finally completely undone and hanging loose around his collar. He didn't say anything. He just stared at her across the 20 feet of damp flagstone. "Henry!" she started, her voice dangerously thin. She cleared her throat, forcing the cynical, bored cadence she had spent years perfecting back into her tone. It felt like trying to glue a shattered vase back together with spit. "You really shouldn't be in here without your coat. The damp will ruin your velvet, and if Lady Covington finds you cornering me in a dark conservatory, she'll have a stroke." It was a good deflection. It was classic Beatrice. Henry didn't smile. He didn't roll his eyes. He reached behind him and pushed the iron door closed. The latch clicked. He turned the key. The metallic grinding sound, loud over the hiss of the steam pipes. He pulled the key from the lock and dropped it into his trouser pocket. Her heart stalled. "What are you doing?" "I am locking the door, Beatrice." His voice was terribly flat. "Because if I don't, You are going to run again, and my boots are not made for chasing women through topiary gardens. I wasn't running, she lied, lifting her chin. The ballroom was stifling. I needed air. It is 90 degrees in this room. I like the heat. You hate the heat. You complain about summer until October. He took a step forward. His boots scuffed against the wet stone. Why did you run? I didn't. Beatrice. He took another step. The anger in his voice wasn't hot. It was a cold, quiet pressure. Do not lie to me. We have exactly one rule between us, and it is that we do not lie to each other. That is a ridiculous rule, she snapped, the panic finally breaching her composure. Everyone lies, Henry. It's the currency of the entire world. I lie to you every day. He stopped, halfway between the door and the planter box. The steam from a nearby pipe hissed, sending a plume of white vapor across the floor between them. What does that mean? It means I am exhausted. She gripped the iron planter so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The damp soil was getting under her fingernails. It means I want to go home. Give me the key. No. Henry, please. The word cracked in the middle. She hated herself for it. She hated the desperate, reedy sound of it. He crossed the remaining distance in 3 long strides. She flinched backward, her hips hitting the damp iron, but there was nowhere else to go. He stopped inches from her. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating off his chest. The smell of harsh tobacco, sweat, and panic rolled off him. Say it again, he commanded, his voice a low rasp. She turned her head sharply, staring at a cluster of rotting white petals on a nearby fern. Don't. Say it again, Beatrice. I am not a performing monkey, she choked out, a hot, angry tear finally spilling over her lashes. It tracked down her cheek, a humiliating wet path. I made a mistake. I was flustered. I misspoke. You didn't misspeak. I did. She turned back to face him, her voice rising to a frantic pitch. I was trying to make a joke, just like you. It was a terrible, unfunny joke, and I regret it. So please, just give me the damn key so I can go home and we can pretend this never happened. Henry stared down at her. The harsh lines of his face were drawn tight, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He didn't look pitying. He looked furious. You think I want to pretend it didn't happen? He asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Yes, because tomorrow you are going to realize that your comfortable, invisible little shield is broken. I am not just the cynical spinster in the corner anymore, Henry. I am a liability. I am the pathetic, desperate woman who actually fell in love with the Duke, and you are going to hate me for ruining the only peace you had. The words tore out of her, jagged and bloody. She braced herself. She waited for the recoil. She waited for the polite, horrified step backward. Henry didn't step back. He reached out and grabbed her shoulders. His hands were large, heavy, and startlingly warm against the thin muslin of her sleeves. His fingers dug into the fabric, grounding her, trapping her. You absolute idiot, he breathed. She blinked, the insult shocking her into silence. You think you're a shield? His grip tightened. He gave her a slight shake, his gray eyes blazing, with a frantic, unmasked energy she had never seen before. You think I stand in that corner with you because you make me invisible? Beatrice, I stand in that corner because it is the only place in that entire godforsaken room I actually want to be. Her breath hitched. The steam pipes hissed loudly. Henry. Shut up, he interrupted, his voice rough. For 3 years, I have listened to you tear down every pompous ass in London. I have watched you roll your eyes at the most beautiful, vacuous women in England. I have stood next to you, smelling like stale smoke, complaining about my roof, terrified that one day you were going to realize you were entirely too good to be standing next to a miserable, exhausted bastard like me. He dropped his forehead against hers. The impact was clumsy, a solid, grounding thud of bone against bone. She gasped, her hands automatically coming up to brace against his chest. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm beneath the thin cotton of his shirt. "I made that joke," he whispered, his breath hot and smelling faintly of whiskey against her lips, "because for 30 seconds I wanted to see what it felt like to say it out loud." The world tilted on its axis. The damp, heavy air of the conservatory suddenly felt like pure oxygen. "You," she struggled to form a coherent thought, her hands curling into his shirt. "You didn't mean it as a joke to Lady Covington." "I wanted to hit Lady Covington with a chair," he muttered, his nose dragging across the slope of her cheek. "But no, it wasn't a joke. It was a test. And when you looked at me with absolute horror, I thought I had just destroyed the only friendship keeping me sane." "I wasn't horrified," she whispered, the admission slipping out, terrified and honest. "I was devastated, because I thought you were mocking me." Henry pulled back just enough to look at her. The harsh gaslight caught the dampness in his eyes. He looked vulnerable, stripped of his aristocratic armor, just as raw and frightened as she was. "I am not mocking you, Bea," he said quietly. He moved his hands from her shoulders to her face. His palms were slightly rough, calloused from holding riding reins, and they cupped her cheeks with a desperate, heavy reverence. He didn't ask for permission. The time for polite hesitation had died in the ballroom. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, practiced sweep of romance. It was a collision. Their teeth clicked awkwardly together on the first impact. He groaned, shifting his angle, his hands sliding back to tangle in her hair, pulling the carefully pinned style completely loose. She gripped his waistcoat, hauling him closer, desperate to close the remaining millimeters of space between them. He tasted like cloves and burnt sugar. The kiss was messy, demanding, and born out of 3 years of repressed, agonizing proximity. It was the desperate translation of every sarcastic remark, every shared eye roll, every silent moment in a crowded room. When he finally pulled away, they were both gasping. Her lips felt bruised, swollen. Her hair was a disaster, falling in limp, humid strands around her face. Henry looked down at her, his chest heaving. A slow, genuine smile broke across his face, transforming the exhausted, cynical Duke into something entirely different, something fiercely alive. "You look terrible," he whispered, his thumb brushing over her swollen lower lip. She let out a wet, breathless laugh, resting her forehead against his collarbone. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in the crown of her ruined hair. They stood there in the stifling heat, the smell of dying orchids masking the stench of the society outside the glass walls. It wasn't a fairy tale. They still had to walk back out there. They still had to face the whispers, the scandalized mothers, and the suffocating rules of the ton. But as Henry's heavy heartbeat settled against hers, the fear began to recede. They were a cynic and a spinster, standing in a puddle of water in a locked room. It was imperfect. It was a disaster. And it was exactly what she wanted. "Henry," she murmured against his shirt. "Yes? Give me the key. I need cold water, and you need to put your coat back on before you catch pneumonia." She felt the rumble of his laughter against her ribs before she heard it. "As you wish, my wife." This time, the words didn't hurt. They anchored her. She smiled, reaching into his pocket to fetch the key herself. If Beatrice and Henry's messy, sarcastic, and deeply grounded love story kept you listening, leave a like and let us know your favorite moment in the comments. Do you prefer sweeping fairy tales or perfectly imperfect romances like this one? Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a good historical drama, and hit that subscribe button with the notification bell turned on so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching.